So Robert Reynolds' The Sentry was created by Rick Veidt, Jay Lee, and Paul Jenkins, and first appeared in the 5-issue miniseries of Marvel Knights, The Sentry Volume 1, Issue Number 1, in September of 2000. Now, for the most part, Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee are usually the ones given credit for the creation of The Sentry, with Rick Veidt having been left out. And there are a couple reasons for this. The first reason is because the version of The Sentry that we will see in Marvel Comics is actually vastly different than the version of the Sentry that was initially created by Paul Jenkins and Rick Veidt. And the reason for this is because Rick Veidt wanted a character who was going to be introduced in such a way that it appeared as though he was simply a forgotten character that had been made by Stan Lee, but he wasn't going to be as powerful as the Sentry was. That Rick Veidt wanted the Sentry to be more of a toned-down character on the same level as Iron Man. But what we saw is that by the time the comic had come to publication, that the Sentry had been given to us in a little bit different of a way and was actually turned out to be one of the most powerful characters in the Marvel Universe. The other reason for why Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee are given so much credit here is because they're considered to be kind of the 1-2 punch of the Marvel Knights series. And the reason why is because Marvel Knights was simply just a series of self-contained publications. These were instances where Marvel took existing characters or existing teams and gave them their own self-contained stories that sort of existed outside of the main events that you saw with Earth 616. Now, by 2006, Joe Quesada had this sort of revamped and had the Marvel Knights series brought in to the mainstream Marvel Universe, but what we saw was that with Inhumans Volume Number 2, that Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee had really kind of established themselves as a very good artist and creator kind of team. And so what we saw was that the Sentry was considered to be their very first creation. And because of what we saw with Inhumans Volume 2, people were very excited to see the Sentry. They were very excited to see what would happen if Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee had moved away from the realm of using existing characters for Marvel Knight imprints and instead had the opportunity to create their own character. And indeed, what we see with this 5-part limited series is quite possibly one of the best stories to ever come out of the Marvel Knights storylines. What we see as we begin with issue number 1 is that Robert Reynolds simply just wakes up one day realizing that the Sentry is him. That he is the Sentry, but that the Void is returning. And the way this story is told to us, we're given this sort of inner monologue with Robert Reynolds, where he talks to himself while at the same time interacting with his environment around him. And what we'll see here with issue number 1 is that Marvel actually set on the path of sort of having this hoax going on, sort of tricking people into believing that the Sentry was a very old character. What we see here is that the Sentry, of course, tells his wife that there's no real reason for concern, that he simply needs to let the dog out. And over the course of the remainder of this first issue, we see the Sentry really kind of remembering who he is, really kind of coming to this understanding. Now, for the most part, the entire 5-issue series is going to be Robert Reynolds regaining his memories with his role as the Sentry, but this sort of just begins the early steps of him coming to an understanding of who he is. He begins to recollect on the fact that it may very well have been years since he was the Sentry. He doesn't know how he got to this place in his life. He doesn't know how he got to this place where he has a house, where he has a dog and he has a wife. He doesn't really know any of this. He simply just realizes that he's here, almost as if he's waking up from a dream. What we also see is that he goes to a bookshelf and takes down a book. And for the most part, he begins to sort of reminisce on himself. He sort of begins to reminisce on how it is that things got this way, how it is that he ended up where he's at, and again, still trying to figure it out. What he also indicates to us is that something called the Void has returned. Now, we'll find out at the end of this 5-issue series, although there'll be obvious clues to really tell us what's going on, but we'll find out at the end exactly what the Void is. But we see that one of the biggest concerns that Robert Reynolds has is that the Void is coming back, and that the only hope that humanity has for being able to defeat the Void is Robert Reynolds himself. From here, we see this sort of jump back. We begin to see the sort of hoax that Marvel created, where they were trying to get us to believe that the Sentry was a character who existed in the 1960s, and that somewhere along the line, the artistry, the story, the character had simply just been lost. And what we see is this sort of backstory in the art style and the kind of storytelling that we saw in the 1960s, where Robert Reynolds had stumbled across the Professor's secret formula. Now, for the most part, in this 5-issue limited series, series, we won't learn who the professor is, but we will find out much later on, beyond this 5-issue limited series, that the professor was in fact Dr. Cornelius, who of course played a major role in the X-Men Schism storyline, and of course the Weapon X program that gave Wolverine his adamantium. But what we see is that this super soldier serum seems to be some kind of serum that maybe is on par with Captain America's formula, or maybe more advanced. Of course, as we'll learn later on, that this serum is far more advanced than the one that gave Captain America his powers. But we see this kind of transition back and forth between these 1960s comics and the depiction of the current events that are going on with Robert Reynolds remembering what's going on. We see, of course, that when he consumes the serum, that he takes on this sort of Captain America kind of transformation, where he goes from being a relatively young person to a large masculine blonde man, kind of a depiction of what it meant to be an athletic individual in the 1960s. We of course see that as Robert Reynolds is remembering these events of him gaining his abilities when he first became the Sentry, that he uses his powers to defend off a young woman in order to really kind of establish himself as a superhero of sorts. We also see that Robert Reynolds takes one of the signature roles of superheroes in the 1960s by developing his own suit. And again, this was really kind of a hallmark of characters in the 1960s, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of people genuinely believed that the Sentry was actually a long-lost character from the 1960s, because in the 1960s, when you had the Jack Kirby, Stan Lee era of comic book characters, one of the hallmarks of their character in their own suits. It's one of the things we saw in Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, so on and so forth. They really sort of established themselves as superheroes by going through the rite of passage, so to speak, by developing their own outfits. Now, eventually what we see here is Robert Reynolds taking a sip of the serum, and he really tells us that it really kind of comes on as a rush, that all these feelings and all these emotions and all these memories begin to slowly trickle in. And when they do, he remembers how great it was to be the Sentry. He begins to remember what it was like to be such a superhero in the eyes of humanity. We, of course, see that the current dog that's with him when he was the Sentry was his sidekick called the Watchdog. But then we begin to see that he kind of begins to question himself and to ask, was that real? Did any of it really actually happen? And this is when we sort of begin to see this sort of psychosis, this kind of maybe schizophrenic element of his character that begins to come into play. And then again, Robert Reynolds begins to touch on the Void. And then we actually see, for the most part, what the Void was capable of and why it is that the Void is considered such a threat, when we see that the Void is able to take on a full contingent of the Avengers, albeit the Avengers from the 1960s, and defeat them single-handedly. Eventually, of course, Robert Reynolds is able to defeat the Void, and the Void tells him that he will return at some point along the line. From here, of course, we see that Robert Reynolds begins to realize that with him taking the serum, that something's happening, that the Void is going to return. And he really takes this time to kind of reflect on himself by simply asking the question, who are you? Who is he as an individual? Is any of the stuff that he recalls as the Sentry real? From here, we actually learn what it is that he can do as the Sentry. Now, this will be expanded on later on, especially when we get into our discussion about the powers and the abilities of the Sentry. But what we learn here is that this serum moves the Sentry's molecules an instant ahead of the current timeline. Now, for whatever reason, I'm not exactly sure why. I think it's simply just something, again, that we just kind of have to accept from the Marvel Comics universe. But because of the fact that this happens, the Sentry has the power of 1,000,000 exploding suns. And so basically, he can do anything. There's nothing that he can't do. His powers are absolutely limitless. And indeed, in the current publication, albeit the fact that the Sentry has actually been dead for a little while and been recreated, that we've never ever seen the upper limits of the Sentry's power. The closest we ever got was during the World War Hulk storyline, which again is something that we'll talk about later on in this video. But for the most part, all this really does is establish to us what it is that the Sentry is capable of doing, and then in fact he is a wildly powerful character. From here, we begin to see that Robert Reynolds, of course, begins to again go into this sort of psychosis. He begins to go into this sort of mental, this place of mental insanity, where he begins to work on some artifacts here and there, some things that remind him of who he was as the Sentry. But due to his inability to focus, that he begins to consume consume more of this super soldier serum. And the more he begins to consume this serum, the more he comes into contact with what seems to be the void. And in fact, one of the things that I would like for you to pay attention here is how it is that he treats this serum. This super serum really seems to be more like a drug. The super serum really seems to be more like an addiction for him. And what we see is that as he begins to consume the serum even more, that eventually he comes into contact with the void. And the void makes its presence known in the form of his dog, which begins to talk to Robert Reynolds and tells Robert Reynolds that he would return. And what this does is it begins to ask us as the reader to ask the question, is Robert Reynolds simply just crazy? Is all this in his mind? Is he really just an insane human being, or does he really have powers? We see, of course, that as far as we can tell, perhaps in his mind, perhaps what's actually happening is that he's able to combat the threat of the void in a couple different ways. The first is by simply shooting an energy projection at the void. The other half is by trying to convince himself and the void that neither of them are real, that neither of them exist. From here, we see that he's kind of in a broken down position. He's really appears to be sobbing, or at the very least trying to get a grip on his situation, which again indicates to us that he may very well be insane. But we see that his wife arrives, and for the most part, it appears as though he's kicked the dog. She also picks up the glass bottle that apparently or supposedly had housed the super soldier serum, and she thinks that he's consuming alcohol again. Now again, all this really does is kind of confuse us a little bit. It asks us the question, is he really crazy? Is he an alcoholic? Is this all in his mind, or is it real? And so, of course, his wife says that she can't handle this anymore, that she's going to go to a friend Julie's house, which may be a sister or a friend, we're not really sure yet. And Robert Reynolds rationalizes again, using his inner monologue, that it's safer for her if she leaves, and so he simply says, okay. From here, his wife seems a little disheartened that after all they've apparently been through, things that we haven't seen in this comic because it picks up in the middle of everything, that he would simply just let her go as opposed to opening up to her and telling her what it is that's going on. From here, his wife seems to have left, and Robert Reynolds, of course, begins to recollect on what's going on, that nobody remembers that he's the Sentry except for him, that he was a hero, that he had his ups and his downs, but in the end, he always did the right thing. And the question is, what's happened that has caused him to forget? What's happened that's caused everybody else to forget? And so what we see is that he sort of puts on this makeshift suit, this sort of, I guess what he perceives to be his own suit. And again, this asks us the question, is Robert Reynolds crazy, or is this all just actually happening? But at the end of the comic, what we learn is that it is happening, that Robert Reynolds is in fact the Sentry, as Robert Reynolds begins to fly, or at the very least, simply just levitate himself into the air. Now from here, over the next 3 comics, what we will see is that Robert Reynolds will approach various superheroes, and what this does is it gives credence to this idea that the Sentry was a very old character that had predated the Fantastic Four, that he had fought alongside Iron Man and Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, because what we see is that he visits each one of these groups or individuals in turn and tries to get them to remember who he is. And what we also see is that while these individuals begin to slowly recollect who he is, while they begin to slowly remember who it is that he is as a person, that for some reason they just can't break the barrier. They can't remember all the escapades that the Sentry was involved in. They can't remember fighting side by side. They simply just recognize the name. But what we also see over the course of this comic is that, or over the course of these comic books, is that eventually the Sentry stumbles across his watchtower, which is something that he had simply just remembered, something that he had just recollected, and that because he recalled it, it was suddenly there. Now the question that has to be asked here is, did he simply just, I guess, will it into existence, or had it always been there? And that question's answered when he actually approaches the watchtower, when he enters the watchtower, and he finds his AI assistant named Clock. Now I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what Clock stands for, but all it is really just a sort of, I guess maybe autonomous robot that is his own personal assistant and carries out what it is that he needs to have done. And what we see is that some sort of transmitter was installed in Clock, and this transmitter, alongside the powers of the Sentry, effectively forced everybody to forget his existence. Now why, we don't really know, but what we see is that Robert Reynolds stumbles across some evidence indicating that perhaps Reed Richards had a hand in this, and that maybe Reed Richards had simply just betrayed him. From here, we see that the Sentry eventually comes around some footage where where when he had supposedly died, that Reed Richards gives a eulogy that effectively tells everybody that the Sentry was a sham, that Robert Reynolds was a liar, that Robert Reynolds used his ability to manipulate, to steal, to get involved in crime syndicates, and that he wasn't this sort of golden hero that everybody had painted him out to be, that he was a far more sinister person. Now, as the story begins to unfold even more, what we see is that eventually Robert Reynolds comes to this understanding that the Void, of course, is returning, the Void is coming back, and that while he does need to ultimately confront Reed Richards over this, that there are far more important things to worry about, that there are much bigger pictures here, that Reed Richards and the Sentry were friends at some point in time, and so there's really no reason for him to believe that that Reed Richards would, in effect, somehow do him wrong. But at the same time, he can't help but believe that this may very well be the case, given the information that's been provided to him. Ultimately, what we see is this sort of series of events come to a head in the final issue of the Sentry versus the Void, which is sort of outside maybe this 5-issue limited series, but is the conclusion to this entire event. And what we see here is that the Void has arrived in New York, and that the contingent of superheroes composed of the Incredible Hulk and Captain America and all of these various individuals that had supposedly fought alongside the Sentry when we were expected to have believed that he was around in the 1960s, that they're all there to confront the Void, that they're all there to effectively try to do what they can in order to keep the Void away. In addition, what we see is that Doctor Strange appears to Reed Richards, and Doctor Strange begins to talk to Reed Richards and say that Reed Richards needs to remember, that he needs to recall what it was that took place. And what we see, or what we get, is this sort of final explanation where we get the missing pieces to this puzzle of what happened between the time that the Sentry existed in Marvel Comics and up until this current point. And what we see is that during a conflict in New York City that had taken place before these 5-issue limited series in Marvel Comics, is that the Void had attacked New York City and had eradicated about 1 million or so people, and had caused a massive amount of devastation. And what the Fantastic Four had learned is that Robert Reynolds is actually the Void, that the Sentry is the other half of his personality. And so the Sentry and the Void are two sides of the same coin, indicating to us that there may very well be some kind of psychosis, or there may very well be some kind of schizophrenia going on in the mind of Robert Reynolds. And that Robert Reynolds at this point doesn't remember this. He doesn't know that he and the Void are, to him, they're two different people. What we see is that with Reed Richards, he gives us again this entire story. And what we learn here is that Robert Reynolds himself was the one who decided that the Sentry needed to be forgotten, that the Sentry needed to go away. Because if the Sentry is remembered by anybody on Earth, then the Void could exist. As long as no one knows who the Sentry is, including Robert Reynolds himself, the Void simply just can't be there, because Robert Reynolds won't know who the Void is. And so what we see is that Robert Reynolds, the Sentry, Reed Richards, along with various other individuals, travel to the Sentry's watchtower, and they install this sort of device that's designed to make everyone forget about who the Sentry is. And we see this again, this sort of circumstance reinventing itself. We see this sort of circumstance coming around again when Robert Reynolds remembers all of this, when this all begins to flood in, when he recalls everything that's been going on, and he recalls the full memories of the fact that he is the Void, and these are the steps that he had previously taken to eliminate the Void from reality. And so what we see is that once again, the Fantastic Four, Reed Richards, along with Doctor Strange, the Sentry, and various other individuals, head back to the Watchtower once again in order to tell Clock that they need to reinitialize this transmitter in order to make everybody forget who the Sentry is. What we also see is that the Void tries to stop the Sentry from doing this, that the Void tries to stop the Sentry from engaging in this activity. And this is something I would like for you guys to pay very close attention to, because the question that I would submit to you is this. When Robert Reynolds first took the Super Soldier Serum, who did he become? Did he become the Void? or did he become the Sentry? Is the Sentry the actual, the real personality of Robert Reynolds, or is the Void the real personality of Robert Reynolds? Now, this is a question that we'll answer later on in this series, but this is one of the best elements of this series, because what it does is it asks us, or it really kind of gives us a reason to ask this question of which one is which side is which, who is Robert Reynolds really? From here, what we see is that the transmitter is activated, and that a wave of energy is spread throughout the world, and that everybody begins to forget about the Sentry, which includes, of course, Robert Reynolds himself. Now, again, what we see going on here is that Robert Reynolds sort of reverts back to his regular life, where he's simply just a man living in a house and he's with his wife. What we also see going on is that because the world doesn't remember who Robert Reynolds is, because they don't remember who the Sentry is, that all the destruction that had taken place at the hands of these various superheroes fighting the Void is attributed to a natural disaster of some kind, to a hurricane or a storm or something like that. As the comic comes to a close, or as this series begins to come to an end, what we see is that Robert Reynolds arrives at the Burger Palace, of course, a place where he and his wife intend to eat, and they, of course, order their respective foods. When the person at the register, who has a scar on his face and is missing an arm, asks Robert Reynolds what it is that he wants, Robert Reynolds has a flashback where he recalls himself as the Sentry alongside this young man as a sidekick, eating chili dogs and talking about how this is humanity's only hope, indicating to us that not all hope is lost, that Robert Reynolds could very well return as the Sentry, which is something that we will see pick up as we move on to the Sentry's reappearance in the creation of the New Avengers in the Marvel Universe.